Good evening. Yet April 19, 2023. Imagine what I do is continue to read some from Cirlot and from Nozick with regards to some of these notions of what goes into the readings of usual questions of the metaphysic and questions of the metaphysics what result for something like a science and also something for like a quest for the deeper truths or deeper meaning or hidden secrets of reality and what goes into how there can be a combined conscientious monism and the theories and the acceptance that there exist alternatives to understandings, yet at the same time there's the ability to reject the unscientific as what the multiverse might be, or that it is not so, in terms of how it's possible to arrive at what our usual source of these reflections on the metaphysics and reflections on understanding and reflections on knowing, so that as we look to and wonder about and consider how it's to be that all such matters of philosophy can arrive at a common base, a common sort of understanding that's suitable for all sorts of people, is at once so that it's made reasonable that there's less of the unscientific and not so much the deterministic notion without freedom of will, or the stochastic notion of random probability without freedom of will, and otherwise the freedom of will, whether or not it's arrived at, that a logical thinking reasoning person can arrive at, that there is a determinism in life, that what will be, yet it is so not written until it is written. In terms of something like the Akashic record, which is a concept that the space-time continuum is a thing and it exists up to a certain point, and there's a space for it in the future, is a different thing than that what will be already is. So that's something that we would consider in various things. And for example, the notions from the East, like the Dzogchen, which is the system of analytical discourse, much like Descartes in the West, is a method of analytical deduction and the metaphysic of reason, that really our result is for reason. And in this manner, when we have reason on our side, it makes it possible that what we can get to is a deconstructive account of reason that so results we are able to have both the benefits of the power of analytical reason and the wonder of curiosity and mystery that arrive at the same sorts notions that all such aspects of the metaphysic bring us in and achieve for us the usual sorts, how you might say, combined superiority of principles of truth and a theory of truth, thus the results that for a philosophy that's logic, that's mathematics, that's a physics and a natural science, that's a science, and the statistics just emerges from this as well, from the fact that there is time going back forever, space going on forever, and in a space and space-time for future events in time, and as this continuum, it moves along this eternal golden braid or the silver thread, that from symbology and phenomenology in the world of our senses, that there's as well the world of our object sense, our rational sense, as where we left off from reading Cirlot in section J and K, king. The king symbolizes universal and archetypal man. The ruling or governing principle, supreme consciousness, virtues of sound judgment, self-control. At the same time, achievement, victory, and consummation. Hence, any man may properly be called a king when he achieves a culminating point in the unfolding of his individual life. All right? Knife. The primacy of the instinctive forces in the man wielding it. Knight. About the steed, he is the master of the logos, the spirit which prevails over the mouth, that is, over matter. This even gets into the concept of the derivation of our word, logos, the word, in the symbology, vis-a-vis logos, the man, and we might point to Philip Jose Farmer's Riverworld novels, and their notion that it's kind of like the Matrix for the steamboat set. And the idea is that a moral test for humanity arises, that they're each brought into a milieu where when they're all brought to life as copies of who they were, their personalities, and when they die, they're brought back to life each time. And thus that there arises what results from when the people discover that this is the case, that there's various hysteresis in a development of how people would react when they no longer have the afterlife to fear, or they no longer have the what would otherwise conserving their time any reason to do so. It's an interesting story. It's a thought experiment. It's an ansatz. It's a Gedanke and a setup. And in these kind of manners, it's kind of a thing that a lot of people who would have been exposed to that in terms of their cultural enrichment by exposure to rich notions of fantasy and concepts of rich notions of fantasy and concepts of their individual will to power or self-determination. That being that the psychology of thinking beings is driven by their interests. It can be very such a thing that results that our models, which might start, the shiny knight and go on to like the neutral mystic enlightened being, and otherwise represent all sorts conscientious and objective appreciations of the moral and ethical in people besides simply the reasoning, that these are some sorts of things that arise so that at least our philosophy of reason keeps it thus that it's simple to both separate those things and to combine them in the overall phenomenology of being on our mortal plane. Labyrinth, an architectonic structure apparently aimless and of a pattern so complex that once inside it is impossible or very difficult to escape. Or it may take the form of a garden similarly patterned. Knot, a complex symbol embracing several important meanings, all of which are related to the central idea of a tightly closed link. Implies also the symbolism of the spiral in the sigmoid line. The sign for an infinity, the horizontal figure 8, aka the lambda gate, as well as the number 8 itself, are at once interlacing and also knotted. And this emphasizes the relation of the knot with the idea of infinity, or rather with the manifestation of the infinite. It is comparable with the net, the loop, and the plate, in that it expresses the concept of binding and fettering, a concept which is generally expressive of an unchanging psychic situation, however unaware of his predicament the individual may be, for example, that of the unliberated man who is tied down by the Iranian god. This is why the flamandialists of the ancient Romans could not wear knots in his habits, and this is also true of the Muslims on pilgrimages to Mecca. These magic associations of binding, which form part of the symbolism of the knot, are sometimes given literal expressions in magical practices, such as those of fishermen in the Shetland Islands who still believe that they can control the winds by the magic use of knots. A knotted cord forms a kind of closed ring or a circumference, and hence it possesses the general significance of an enclosure and of protection. The slip knot is a determinative sign in the Egyptian language, entering into composition words such as calumny, oaths, or a journey. The meaning must have originated in the idea of keeping in touch with someone who's far away, and there is unquestionably some connection with the enigma of the hanged man in the tarot pack. The endless knot is one of the 8 emblems of good luck of Chinese Buddhism, representing longevity. The symbolism here is take one aspect of the concept of the knot, that of pure connection, and apply it to the biological and phenomenal planes. Finally, the famous Gordian knot, cut by Alexander the Great by virtue of his determination in his sword, is the long-standing symbol of the labyrinth, arising out of the chaotic and inextricable tangle of the cords with which it was tied. To undo the knot was equivalent to finding the center which forms such an important part of all mystic thought, and to cut the knot was to transfer the pure idea of achievement and victory to the plane of war and existence. So you can see that this is very deeply seated in the metaphor, and what was available is the metaphor, and what was available is the visually graphical, and that which was so identifiable at a glance in terms of that these concepts are related according to what are usually enough, both very, very common Mian, and also the notions of this mystic or spiritual aspect of whoever or whatever would be involved in trying to figure out these greater secrets and the mysteries. The esoteric vis-a-vis the exoteric, the outside, that these graphical symbols are conceptual words or logos. And that's just a kind of a thing that this sort of book, like the Dictionary of Symbols, helps to represent as providing a context of sort with regards to how the ancients and over time, and then the schools of these various mystics who, lacking a scientific foundation or lacking the granting of an unfettered sort of theosophical approach to scientific foundations, as for example, there was a parlayed wisdom, and it was deemed inviolable, that it can still be so that the theosophical is a thing, and with our scientific foundations, and that this sort of book still helps reflect that in our Lizardian brains and where things come from, and how the mystic makes these things that is like so. Here's an entry, for example, on the turtle. And in our mathematical use these days, it just reflects to a comment at a conference. When one was asked, where does the world stand? And it stands on the back of a turtle. Well, then what does that stand on? Well, it stands on the back of a turtle. And then how can that be? That's turtles all the way down. So in looking through this book, there's entries on the sun and the stars, and on the stag and the staff and the squaring the circle. Our concern is not with the mathematical, but the symbolic problem. Squaring the circle, like the lapis or the aurum philosophicum, was one of the preoccupations of the alchemists. Whereas the latter two are symbols of the quest for the evolutive goal of the spirit, the former problem concerned the equating the two great cosmic symbols of heaven, or the circle, and earth, or the square. It is to do, then, with the union of two opposites, not juxtaposition as in the conjunctio of the two arms of the cross, for example, but the equations and canceling out of two components in a higher synthesis, or their outer product, their greater synthesis. This square was seen to correspond to the 4 elements. The aim of squaring the circle, then, which strictly ought to be called circling the square, was to obtain unity in the material world, as well as in the spiritual life, over and above the differences and obstacles, the static order of the number 4 and the 4-cornered square. We have already suggested that the rotated square was reckoned an important part of this project, and Heinrich Conrath comments in his Van Heliation Chaos, by means of circumrotation or circulatory revolution, the quaternary is restored to pure simplicity and innocence. Another means of getting an ersatz squaring was to superimpose 2 squares, inscribing a circle within them, such way as to form an octagon. The octagon can indeed be considered in both a geometric and a symbolic sense as the intermediary form between the square and circle. For this reason, it never symbolized the opus itself, that is, the mystic consummation of the synthesis of opposites, but it did stand for the path indicated by things quaternary, such as the earth, the feminine element, matter, or reason, towards a circle representing perfection, eternity, and spirit. This is why in many medieval baptisteries, fonts and cupolas are octagonal in shape. So that's rather remarkable. And what I was curious is this entry for the spiral. This is where a spiral space-filling curve is the same thing as drawing a line segment, as of putting the pencil to paper and making a mark, and that it is a unit line segment, that it is drawing of the line, it's the act, it's the opus or work. It is the auto, the act. It is the opus, the work. It is the making of a measure. It is the making of a mark, and so that is just line drawing itself. And so this idea of the spiral space filling curve is what happens after the course of deduction that arrives at this, that filling the spiral space filling curve is the act therefore of itself, and that this point in space arise automatically. That's this origin in space are the same sort of thing with regards to that which draws in from it and that which goes out from it. So it kind of results then also that since times before history, and in, for example, the most ancient traditions for which we still have reckonings of their higher order symbolry, that the spiral was the symbol for mathematics itself. And so as we were just talking a little bit about squaring the circle, and that being as for geometry, which is above that, which is, after that act, regardless of how that can be arrived at. Because one can think of several ways to make it so that the combinations of intersections or compositions of disjoint elements can make such similar figures geometrically that it's not so necessary, given those sorts of elements, that one needs a fundamental continuum already given this way or derived this way to arrive at the rest of mathematics and the squaring the circle bit. That still the symbolry is inherited and remains, and it really means infinity and the void and together. And about how there's this reasoning about the nature of things, that this sort of continuum, and it's at once this monism about it, that it's individuated with individua, but it's still as a whole and with parts, and that these points make wholes and aggregates, and these sorts of things about the very fundamental smoothness of the grain, is about how that arises for what was discussed as axiomless deduction, because it's as such from first principles and not so much any kind of stipulation at all. It's not making any judgments to see that it so arises. It's only so observing that from not so doing that it arises, that in this way it's a very special thing in terms of the symbolry, and that over time, like when we looked at, for example, the Ananta was like the most ancient symbol of mathematics, and it was the most original mathematician of sorts, and the patron of the field of mathematics. That the spiral thus represents that sort of thing. Whereas, for example, in that shell on the desk, the conch shell, it also has a spiral, and it also grows, and it's a natural thing is about its growth. And as the world spins around, it's about that origin, and ditto with any other circular thing. And that it results that's the sort of thing that makes for, in this notions of the knots and the squaring the circle and the spiral, why these kinds of symbols are also Plato's ideals. They're not just our phenomenology, which are our senses combined with our feelings and emotions and reflections on things, and the various badges of recognition, but that it as well reflects naturally. It's a deep association that graphically it looks the same from any direction, in any dimension. It's the same thing. That it's infinite dimensional and fills the space and is the space, and that its opposite is the same. Spiral, a schematic image of the evolution of the universe. It is also a classical form symbolizing the orbit of the moon and a symbol for growth relating to the golden number, rising, so Hussein maintains, out of the concept of the rotation of the earth. In the Egyptian system of hieroglyphs, the spiral, corresponding to the Hebrew vav, denotes cosmic forms in motion or the relationship between unity and multiplicity. Of special importance in relation to the spiral are bonds and serpents. Here, the usual notions of the serpents include the serpent in the garden, the serpent, the Midgard serpent about the earth, and those are the two big ones. The spiral is essentially macrocosmic. The above ideas have been expressed in mythic form as follows. From out of the unfathomable deeps there arose a circle shaped in spirals. Coiled up within the spirals lies a snake, a symbol of wisdom and eternity. Now, the spiral can be found in three main forms, expanding as in the nebula, contracting like the whirlwind or whirlpool, or ossified like the snail's shell. This reminds of Descartes' theory of vortices, which are like funnels and spirals, and that they represent his notion of what would be any kind of centralization of a moment. So that's the same sort of thing as his atomic theory, his particle theory, and his wave theory combined, in that it has a center that is its sort of particle, and that it has a surrounds, which is its wave. And then the idea is that all these are constructive or destructive, that Descartes kind of foresaw a particle wave theory and duality, which we know is the way of things in our modern physics, this way. And it can be considered that he arrived at it from reason, including this expression of the symbology with which he would not have been unfamiliar. In the first case, it is an active sun symbol. In the second and third cases, it's a negative moon symbol. Nevertheless, most theorists, including Eliade, are agreed that the symbolism of the spiral is very complex and of doubtful origin. Its relationship with lunar animals and with water has been provisionally admitted. Going right back to the most ancient traditions, we find the distinction being made between the creative spiral, rising in a clockwise direction and attributed to Pallas Athena, and the destructive spiral, like a whirlwind, which twirls around to the left and is an attribute of Poseidon. As we have seen, the spiral, like the snake or serpent, and the Kundalini force of Tantrist doctrine, can also represent the potential center, as in the example of the spider's web. Be that as it may, the spiral is certainly one of the essential motifs of the symbolism of ornamental art all over the world, either in the simple form of a curve curling up from a given point or in the shape of scrolls or sigmas, etc. Parkin observes in his prehistoric art that no ornamental motif seems to have been more attractive than the spiral. Ortiz suggests that from a semantic point of view, the spiral is an emblem of atmospheric phenomena and of the hurricane in particular. The fact is that the hurricane, in its turn, is a symbol of secession from the creative as well as destructive functions of the universe. That is, of the suspension of the provisional but pacific order of the universe. He also points to the connection between breathing and the creative breath of life. He goes on to suggest that the volute in ancient cultures was a spiral form symbolizing the breath and spirit. It is for this reason that the Egyptian god Thoth is represented with a large spiral on his head. Thoth was also the Egyptian god of knowledge. Finally, by virtue of its significance in connection with creation, with movement and progressive development, the spiral is an attribute of power, found in the scepter of the Egyptian pharaoh, in the litus of Roman augurs, and in the present-day walking stick. In addition to the above, it is also possible that the spiral may symbolize the relationship between the circle and the center. Here it is rather as so, and it's also for this line drawing. For the spiral is associated with the idea of the dance, and especially with primitive dances of healing and incantation, when the pattern of movement develops as a spiral curve. So spiral movements closely related to the pattern of the mandala and to the spiral form that appears so frequently in art from the Mesolithic age onwards, particularly in France, Ireland, and England, may be regarded as figures intended to induce a state of ecstasy and to enable man to escape from the material world and to enter the beyond through the whole symbolized by the mystic center. Striking examples of such spirals are those of Gravinius, Morbihan, Newgrange, Leinster, Carnwath in Scotland, and Castle Archdal in Ulster. Next entry is double spiral. The double spiral represents the completion of the sigmoid line and the ability of the sigmoid line to express the intercommunication between two opposing principles, is clearly shown in the Chinese yang-yin symbol. So this goes from that the origin is everywhere, original analysis, Cartesian analysis, after the Euclidean, the center of the diagram, that there's two origins, and it establishes a basis for relativity. There is the absolute, and then establishing the basis for relativity is like the objective and subjective and this type of thing, is clearly shown in the Chinese Yang-Yin symbol, or more, as is more commonly known, yin-yang. Two double spirals intersecting form the swastika with curved arms, a motif which is fairly common, although not so frequent as the arrangement of a series of double spirals in a continuous rhythm. It has been suggested that the motif first appeared in Danubian culture, whence it sprang outwards to the north and south of Egypt and across Asia to the Far East. Now, one thing I'll just be curious is, again, this is published in 1962, but it was published between 46 and 53. All right. It has been suggested that this motif first appeared in Danubian culture, whence it spread outwards to the north and south of Europe and across Asia to the Far East. Whereas the architectural meander of straight lines and right angles is a symbol of earth, the double spiral is closely linked with water. Given that water is the element of transition, transformation, regeneration, the double spiral is capable of fully representing its symbolic significance. Hence, it is of common interest occurrence in the Cretan and other markedly marine cultures. From a cosmic point of view, the double spiral may be regarded as the flattened projection of the two halves of the egg of the world, or of the primordial hermaphrodite separated into two halves, or of the upper and lower waters. Hence, together with the St. Andrew's cross and the drum, shaped rather like an hourglass, constitutes a symbol of inversion and of the relationship between opposites. So this symbology, it represents these cultural connections and what concepts and ideas they would have been meant to evoke in their decorative form and their ornate and this and that. And of course, this book includes many elements from the tarot and other things that would be considered silly of a sort, or not relevant, like the ship of fools, shoes, a sieve. Although the sieve here represents, as was just discussed, the ideas of the squaring the circle. Sigma, the S shape, both vertical and horizontal, together with all its derived forms, known generally in the art of ornamentation as scrolls, symbolize relationship and movement over the underlying rhythm of apparently continuous motion. As Ortiz has noted, sigmoid signs like the spiral have been utilized as symbols of the wind, but they are more properly related to the whirlwind or whirlpool. The double symmetric spiral, like the Ionic volute, may, according to a suggestion of Breuil, be a stylized image of the bull's horns. The curved swastika is composed of two intersecting sigmas. A different, wider, and deeper implication of the sigma, closely connected, however, the symbolism of the whirlwind and the hurricane as a synthesis of elements and as the supreme cosmic moment, is afforded by Schneider's suggestion that the sigma, especially in its vertical position, is a representation of the stream winding its way down the mountainside and so constituting a characteristic symbol of the valley mountain axis, or earth heaven, in other words, the Hyros Gamos. He further suggests that this S shape may be formed by one waning moon plus another waxing, the symbols for the two alternating phases, the evolutive and involutive processes which govern the sacrificial relationship of earth and heaven. He believes that this is the explanation of the frequency of the sigma in primitive ornamentation. Now, these days, the integral bar is probably the most familiar use of this form. Leibniz's integral bar is after the Greek letter sigma, this sigma shape, that it is the curving sigma, and it does represent this notion of motion in the mensuration, the quantification of what's this quality, or this quality of the qualification of the continuous motion. So when we think of its place, it very much represents this same sort of extension, the expression from when sigma was the letter for the summing of finite terms, and then later as it became the key for the analysis in its relation to the differential, that it is so like so. Now there is space here, so as a complement to our point in our geometry of point and spaces, instead of Euclid's of points, lines, and planes, and ... each one later defined, and then the formulas that so arise given the compass and edge after he axiomatizes the existence of the compass and edge, is that this axiomless geometry, which arises from a point in space, and then provides basically an edge as that the straight line is drawn, and also provides a measure, and then the compass as of the fact that the outer and outer side of this spiral is this compass as well. As that there's an entry for space in Cirlot's Dictionary of Symbols, which of its time and place in the late 1940s and early 1950s would have gathered since all time in history and according to art and the theories of philosophy, usual reckonings of his lands as continental from Spain in his schooling by the Jesuits. In a matter of speaking, the space is an intermediate zone between the cosmos and chaos. Taken as a realm of all that is possible, it is chaotic. Regarded as the region in which all forms and structures have their existence, it is cosmic. Space soon came to be associated with time, and this association proved one of the ways of coming to grips with the recalcitrant nature of space. Another, and the most important, was the concept of space as a three-part organization based upon its three dimensions. Each dimension has two possible directions of movement, implying the possibility of two poles or two contexts. To the 6 points achieved in this way, there was added a seventh, the center, and space thus became a logical structure. The symbolisms of level and of orientation were finally brought to bear in order to complete the exegesis. The three dimensions of space are illustrated by means of a three-dimensional cross whose arms are oriented along these 6 spatial dimensions made up of the 4 points of the compass plus the 2 points of the zenith and the nadir. According to René Guénon, the symbolism, because of its structural character, is identical with that of the sacred palace or the inner palace of the Kabbalah, located at the center point from which the 6 directions radiate. In the three-dimensional cross, the zenith and the nadir correspond to the top and the bottom, the front and back to the east and west, the right and left to the north and south. The upright axis is the polar axis, the north-south axis is the solstitial line, the east-west is the equinoctial. Significance of the vertical or level symbolism concerns the analogy between the high and the good, the low and the inferior. The Hindu doctrine of the 3 gunas, sattva, height superiority, rajas, intermediate zone of the world of appearances or ambivalence, and tamas, inferiority or darkness, is in itself sufficient to explain the meaning of the symbolization of level up and down the vertical axis. It is in consequence the intermediate plane of the 4 directional cross, that which incorporates the cardinal points and which implies a square, which represents the world of appearances. Taken next to the east-west axis, traditional orientation symbolism associates the east being the point of sunrise, the spiritual illumination, in the west the point where the sun sets with death and darkness. Passing next to this north-south axis, there is no one definite interpretation. In many Oriental cultures, the zenith coincides with a mystic whole through which transition and transience are affected, that is the path from the world of manifestation, spatial and temporal, to that of eternity. But it has also been identified with the center of the three-dimensional cross, taken as the heart of space. Reduced to 2 dimensions, those are the contrasting horizontal and vertical arms. The cross comes to represent harmony between extension associated with width and exaltation with height. The horizontal arm concerns the implications of a given gradation or movement in an individual's existence, and the vertical pertains to moral elevation. William of St. Thierry, describing the 7 gradations of the soul, observes that it extends these steps in order to reach the celestial life. If we seek an interpretation which will justify the 4 points of the horizontal plane being reduced to 2, the left and right, we can find a basis for it in Jung's assertion that the rear part coincides with the unconscious and the front with the manifest or consciousness, and since the left also can be equated with the unconscious and the right with consciousness, the rear then becomes equivalent to the left and right and the front to the right. Other equivalents are left side of the past, the sinister, the repressed, involution, the abnormal and the illegitimate, the right side of the future, the felicitous, openness, evolution, the normal and the legitimate. In all this, there is an apparent contradiction with the corresponding number symbolisms. Paneth observes that in most cultures, the uneven numbers are considered to be masculine and the even numbers to be feminine. Since the left side is the zone of origin and the right that of the outcome, corresponding number symbolisms would seem to be 1, the uneven or masculine number for the left side, that is the past, and 2, the even or feminine number for the right side, the subsequent or outcome. The solution is to be found in the fact that the number 1 unity never corresponds to the plane of the manifest world or to spatial reality. It is the symbol of the center, but not in the sense of occupying any situation in space which might imply a sequel. Hence we must conclude that 2 is the number corresponding to the left side, and 3 is that related to the right.
Canon explains the way in which the cosmic order confirms that with all this an lucid exposition of the relevant Hindu doctrines to the effect that the right-hand zone is the solar region, the left hand the lunar. Quote, in the aspect of this symbolism which refers to the temporal condition, the sun in the right eye corresponds to the future, the moon in the left eye to the past. The frontal eye corresponds to the present, which from the point of view of the manifested is but an imperceptible moment, comparable to the geometrical point without dimensions in the spatial order. That is why a single look from the third eye destroys all manifestation, which is expressed symbolically by saying that it reduces everything to ashes, and that is also why it is not represented by any bodily organ. But when one rises above this contingent point of view, the present is seen to contain all reality, just as the point carries within itself all the possibilities of space. And when succession is transmuted into simultaneity, all things abide in the eternal present, so that the apparent destruction is truly transformation. Now, the 7 aspects that define space have been regarded as the origin of all septenary groups, and in particular of the 7 planets, the 7 colors, and the 7 kinds of landscape. Hence, Luke Benoist can assert that the Christian Church, by building on earth a mighty 3-dimensional cross of stone, has created for the entire world the coordinate lines of a supernatural geometry. Benoist then quotes Clement of Alexandria as saying that the 6 directions of space symbolize or are equivalent to the simultaneous and eternal presence of the 6 days of creation, and that the 7th day of rest signifies the return of the sender and the beginning. Once the cosmic sense of spatial symbolism has been demonstrated, it is simple to deduce its psychological applications, and once the static laws have been determined, it is easy to grasp the dynamic implications, always bearing in mind this symbolism of orientation. Here we must point out that the swastika, a solar and polar symbol, implies a movement from right to left, like the apparent movement of the sun, and that Clotho, one of the Parcae, or Fates, spins her wheel of destiny in the same direction, that is, the opposite way to existence, so destroying it. Right-handedness is characteristic of all symbols of natural life, hence in the Egyptian system of hieroglyphs, to enter is to go towards the right, and to go out is to go towards the left. Orienting these hieroglyphs, we have the right corresponding with the rise and the left with the setting of the sun. Similarly, the right side takes on an extra implication of birth and life, while the left side acquires an association with death. Another consequence, apparent in allegories and emblems, is that the right side corresponds to the higher virtues, if one may put it that way, such as compassion, and the left side to justice. All the above conclusions are logical deductions drawn from the study of Oriental tradition, supported by the findings of experimental psychology. But they are conclusions which have also been verified by anthropologists and sociologists in their studies of the habits of diverse peoples. Anya Teilhard, for example, has collated a mass of facts. She quotes J.J. Bakoven as asserting in his Mutterrecht und Urreligion und Graber-Symbolik der Alten that in the important and very common equation right hand equals masculinity, the left hand harbors magic powers and the right hand the force of reason. And also that in matriarchal societies one always finds its idea of superiority attributed to the left side, and conversely. To turn to the left is to look back upon the past, the unconscious implying introversion. To turn to the right is to look upon the outside world, implying action and extroversion. At the same time, ethnologists are agreed that during the first stage of any period of sun worship, the right side becomes preeminent, whereas in lunar cults it is the left side which prevails. His paintings, reliefs, and other artistic creations of a man, the left side is characterized by a more vivid projection of the self, that is, by identification, and the right side is more extrovert. Well, reading this extended entry on space and orientation and direction and bringing in these other concepts of the center and the flowing and the movement and the sun and the moon, or the earth and water of these elements, and relating how the symbolism relates, for example, to the cross as a stated example of the direction of orthogonality and this kind of thing. And order, and then his mention of the third eye of Buddhist thought, which is what one develops by higher order transcendental thinking and results in extrasensory organ, another sense, an object sense, that is able to result that this really is what results this true matter of will, that it's turning to ashes of these other parts of the multiverse, is only in the sense that it also creates them at once. That is really interesting in a sense to look at this as symbolism and appreciate and realize that it's not mathematical. It's not, although it is methodical and it is organized and it does reflect various senses that may be part of a greater language that in all its forms with that more detail would be just as richly satisfying as a formal language in terms of the expression of greater statements or truth. It also reflects that this is a very natural diagram for any and all sorts of things. Because space is how we naturally view things in terms of their proportion and form and their relative locations to each other and their relative motions to each other. So that's kind of interesting. I wonder what center has. There's heaven, Chinese symbol of heaven. The hole in the circular image of space signifies the trap path of transcendence. Darkness equated with matter. Modesto Quetzart. This is one of these sand paintings that are only visible from a great height. Portal of the Church of San Pablo del Campo, Barcelona. 2 columns and the tetramorphs. 4 symbols. Looking for center. Bow. Now, bow is like Ulysses' bow, Homer's bow, even Homer Dormitat. Shiva's bow is like the lingam, the emblem of the god's powers. Basic to the symbolism is concept of tension, clearly defined by Heraclitus and closely related to the life force and spiritual force. Benoist remarks that the bow and the arrow, as attributes of Apollo, stand for the sun's energy, its rays, and its fertilizing and purifying powers. Symbolism of the crossbow is similar but more complex, including as it does the conjunction of the bow and its stock. Right. Center, chariot, the cherubim, child, chimere, choice, crossroads, a balanced symmetry of 2 opposing principles. Chrysalis, in the words of Wang Chung, the chrysalis precedes the cicada. Chthonian demons, includes the Harpies, Erinyes, Hindu Rakshasas, Arabic jinns, Germanic elves, and Valkyries. They're symbols of thanatic forces, the death wish. Circle. Oh, there's a circle. It shows a yin yang surrounded by the 8 trigrams, or what? Looks kind of like so. These days, yin yang is also often a symbol for martial arts, but it represents the balance and change and this kind of thing. Circumference, Cithara, a symbol of the cosmos, its strings corresponding to the levels of the universe. Being rounded on the one side and flat on the other like the turtle, it comes to signify the synthesis of heaven and earth. Okay. Clover or trefoil, clock. Like all circular forms, incorporating a number of internal elements, the clock may be interpreted as a kind of mandala. Since the essence of the clock is to tell the time, the predominant symbolism is that of number. As a machine, the clock is related to the notions of perpetual motion, automata mechanism, and to the magical creation of beings that pursue their own autonomous existence. Well, that's something I didn't really consider, with the notion that the clock is this sort of a thing. It represents the passage. It represents a reference to what is the passage of time and how time carries and what time is and this sort of thing, if I'm not too far off now. That it's an interesting notion. The clock, I'll leave it like so here. Like so. That thusly the clock is among the symbols that Cirlot reflects that these days, because everybody only reads from a digital clock and very few actually have what would be the analog clock or the sundial's clock, that the entire symbology is not so much available. Coffer cold, live past center, thus that returning to center is here we have the entry for center, C-E-N-T-R-E. To leave the circumference for the center is equivalent to moving from the exterior to the interior, from form to contemplation, from multiplicity to unity, from space to spacelessness, from time to timelessness, and all symbols expressive of the mystic center. The intention is to reveal to man the meaning of the primordial paradisal state and to teach him to identify himself with the supreme principle of the universe. The center is in effect Aristotle's unmoved mover and Dante's L'amore che muove il sol all'altra stella. Similarly, Hindu doctrine declares that God resides in the center at that point where the radii of a wheel meet at its axis. In diagrams of the cosmos, the central space is always reserved for the creator so that he appears as surrounded by a circular or almond-shaped halo formed by the intersection of the circle of heaven with the circle of the earth, surrounded by concentric circles spreading outwards, and by the wheel of the zodiac, the 12-monthly cycle of labor upon the land, and a four-part division corresponding both to the seasons through the tetramorph. Among the Chinese, the infinite being is frequently symbolized as a point of light with a concentric circle spreading outwards from it. In Western emblems, an eagle's head sometimes carries the same significance. In some Hindu mandalas, such as the Sri Yantra, the center itself is not actually portrayed, but has to be supplied mentally by the contemplator. The Sri Yantra is a form and expansion and a symbol, therefore, the creation, composed of 9 intersecting triangles, circumscribed by a lotus flower and a square. A great many ritual acts have the sole purpose of finding out the spiritual center of a locality, which then becomes a site, either in itself or by virtue of the temple built upon it, of an image of the world. There are also many legends which tell pilgrimages to places with characteristics which relate them to paradise. This Chinese tale, for example, retold by the Orientalist Wilhelm in his work on Lao Tse. King Huangti had a dream. He crossed into the kingdom of the Huasu. The kingdom of the Huasu is west of the far west and north of the far north. It is not known how many hundreds of thousands of leagues it is from the Chu state. It can be reached neither by boat, nor by carriage, nor on foot. It can be reached only by the spirit in flight. This country has no sovereign. Everyone acts according to his own dictates. The people have no lawmakers. Everyone acts according to his own dictates. The joys of life are not known, nor is there fear of death, so there is no premature death. Self-withdrawal is not known, nor is the shunning of one's fellows, so there is no love and no hate. Reversion from what is distasteful is not known, nor is the search of pleasure, so there is no profit and no harm. No one has any preference, no one has any dislike. They enter the water and are not drowned, walk through fire and are not scorched. They rise up into the air as others walk on the face of the earth. The rest in spaces or to sleep in beds. Clouds and mist do not veil their gaze. Claps of thunder do not deafen their ears. Neither beauty nor ugliness dazzles their hearts. Neither mountain nor ravine impedes their progress. They walk only in the spirit. This concept of the center coincides, of course, with that of the land of the dead, in which the theme of the coincidentia oppositorum of mystic tradition comes to signify not so much opposition as neutralization in a characteristically oriental sense. The center is located at the point of intersection of the two arms of the superficial or two-dimensional cross, or the three arms of the essential three-dimensional cross. In this position, it expresses the dimension of the infinite depth of space, that is the seed of the eternal cycle of the flux and flow of forms and beings, as well as the dimensions of space itself. Some liturgical crosses, as for example that of Cong in Ireland, the center is marked by a precious stone. The next entry is for Cerberus, or Cerberus, a three-headed dog that is always on the alert in every direction. Well, that's rather interesting as to read from Cirlot, and for me, it helps me just really confirm my notions of something like this analytical discourse on the spiral space-filling curve as arising for an axiomless natural deduction of an axiomless natural geometry, this point in space, that it's very natural in terms of its symboly and imaging. And when it gets to that in prior times, the same sorts of concepts are evinced by the recollection and the reckoning of what would be the existence of this sorts of things, are as a sort of removal from material, and as well a grounding in the firmament, that the dialectic and the objectively critical and the critically objective helps it once again arise at why it's so comforting and compelling to have that these kinds of things are like so. And this sort of conversation, these readings, came after Robert Nozick, when I picked up his book and looked through it, and the first thing I saw was his reflections on why is there something rather than nothing. And he explains at once why it's the fundamental question of the metaphysics, at least for Heidegger and Kant and Nozick and other people who are highly regarded as high-powered, respectable philosophers, that that's as of a modernist sense that there might be of it. Besides that, then we can relate that to all sorts of symbolism in mysticism, which is supposed to represent these same great truths. They're the same great truths. It's the attaining to the same secret wisdom. While it says yet modern and technical, and it's a technical philosophy, or it's arriving at a science, with room for religion, with room for monotheism, and as to why religion is just kind of discussions of our stories and confirmations of our things, about how there's much to be said for it. That as we're talking about the continuum and meaning and truth and God and these kinds of things, that for example, to pick a quote at random, I am unable to give even a hint of the grandiose scheme of this overarching process, which consists in the differentiating and self-returning of the individual moments of religion. To do that, I would have to show how the rational structure, which organizes the shapes of the Vorstellung, repeats the basic structures of the Phenomenology as a whole, consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, spirit, and therefore makes the Vorstellung recapitulate all the previous stages of the thought process according to the most fundamental insight of Hegel's thought, namely that the spirit is present as a whole at each of its phases, and that it proceeds not by external additions, but by inner development in a cumulative manner. This from this section Vorstellung and Hegel about the logic of theological inquiry. This is where this is an interesting collection, this Meaning, Truth, and God, because it's for the technical philosopher, reflections on theism, monism, and as well for apologetics and this kind of thing. That these are modern philosophers, and they're technical philosophers. And Cirlot is included in terms of his accounts here of the culmination of what remains of the mystic and occult, including all these deep attachments of these very simple symbols and the symbolry to them. Cirlot, as a symbologist, is that he's a phenomenologist, and that he points to, for example, the third eye, which is an aspect of object sense that is, if it's a phenomenology, it's a purely rationed phenomenology. It's a purely reasoned phenomenology. That if the philosopher demands that, well, we're only the product of our perception and senses, is that there is such sense. It makes for Plato that there is this one universe which contains it, as for the strong metonymy, as was discussed largely in the last discussion of Cirlot, and in this last reading of Nozick, of which this is sort of the third course, that there's really a way to cultivate this sense of from nothing everything, and from everything nothing, that we're able to line up all our great technical philosophers, or as with regards to how they're already so organized this way. That for Plato is in Aristotle and Archimedes and Socrates and da da da, and then for the German continentals, or Kant and Hegel, and then up to Heidegger, and then as about Leibniz as a very significant thinker about the monadology, who in Descartes, of course, and in the West, in the East, for the Dzogchen, for the Tantra, that these legends of our canon in our technical philosophy still we are adherents to them, because together they each reflect a different aspect that still all combines to arrive at having the sum culmination of already having had the debates, already having had the arguments for and against, why and why not. These things are like so. So then we talk again about Nozick's philosophical explanations, which he lays out a course saying, hey, this is at least a course where if we don't need to dive right into the center of being as a necessary tractatus that we have philosophical explanations to break it all down, and we can even get back around to it and take or leave it as we see fit. Which you can take or leave as you see fit, and it is what it is. That these technical philosophers then have provided how it's possible to have this axiomless natural deduction be very rich in the whole thing. It's a noumenon for the phenomenon. It's the Plato's ideals for the immediate evaluation of our senses. And as well that we have this object sense and number sense and reason sense, and that we can establish some of the aspects of the development of it with the usual classical developments of the Tantra or hires of ethical and moral reasoning, that ethical and moral reasoning and the ability to be objective and critical about it, and is once attached and detached, or the lawful good paladin and the neutral meditator, that these are the same sorts of roles of development that people go through to arrive at the comprehension of these higher level things, then be able to bring it back down and help explain why thus it results that such symbols of the mathematics like the spiral, space, fill, and curve are a real thing, and that it's a central object as a function and a shape and a feature and a construct in mathematics, like Descartes' vortex, in fact very like Descartes' vortex, or as otherwise why it's so central then that we arrive at the same things that are already the rest of our canon of the logic and the philosophy, that the logic of the coming and going and the tendencies together and apart and this restitution and oscillation and the dissipation and attenuation are natural principles. They don't demand anything but that out of a vacuum there is a flowing, or out of a pressure there is a going, or this kind of thing. That there's simply in these manners the way to, without further ado, have that then what can be arrived at for an axiomless natural deduction is the same as of the perfect forms as what could otherwise then, once it's all assembled, be just considered a given. So that in this manner, it really helps to make it possible to resolve a lot of what would be contradiction or the invalidation of thinking, or the rejection of a monist view with rejection of a monist view, or the acceptance of a monist view. It makes it simple in a lot of ways to keep things simple while still having as much knowledge as possible. It's always possible to frame it as like, this is, for example, some selfish person's best way to know and fit the most in their head with the least baggage. And as well, it's the easiest way for them to have the biggest words to say that will be the biggest words to other people. It's a grandiosis as much as it is as so enshrined in the East and West, how sometimes it's a reduction and about less is more and this kind of thing. Here's that more is more and less is more, and infinity and the void are complementary concepts that together comprise the center and comprise the thing. Looking back inward on the symbols now we've discussed this time to arrive at how great they are. And that it's a common thread, it's a silver thread, it's an eternal braid, it's the plate, it's the net, it's the skein, as was talked about, and we can apply these directly to these notions of continuity. And it wouldn't be so surprising to find that, wow, these in the secret learnings of these ancient cultures, these same symbols, the exoteric, were as well almost immediately and directly these same mathematical primitives in their esoteric, and formally so, and as strongly as formally as we have today, because mathematical truths are enduring. This is Hilbert's infinite living museum of mathematics. And it's just not so surprising and unlikely that when we get back to some caveman 40,000 years ago, that he's written Pythagoras' theorem in circles and squares with rocks and sticks. It's been gathering dust. It's the same proof at least once. So anyways, that's an interesting discussion, I hope. And if you have a great day, it'll be yours. And I shall so hope that it's good. So long.